Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. Today we spoke with Nadia Uberoi, who is the head of people at Garner Health. This was one of the episodes I've been most looking forward to because we combined a conversation about how we systematize HR to support business objectives, as well as the role of having a high-candor culture. There are a few things that I really enjoyed about this particular episode. First was at the beginning, Nadia talked about the way that they align their HR strategy to the overall business strategy, starting from the mission all the way down to quarterly business goals. Second, she talked about the importance of the people that they bring in, because with this focus, particularly on aligning continuously to quarterly business goals, you have to have a highly agile set of individuals working within the system, and how that was important to making the whole thing work. So a combination of the system as well as the individuals. And then the third thing was talking about how important having that high candor culture is to receiving feedback, but also to everyone in the organization feeling like they're responsible for taking action on the feedback. Where I saw this particularly come out was when she was talking about performance management and how they actually assess the value and impact of performance management and make changes, but that those changes are not only for HR to make, but for the whole organization to make. So it's not here, you HR, go make these changes. It's we as an organization have to make these changes because that's the feedback we're getting. So it was really interesting how that high candor culture played into the way that people saw their responsibilities for their people as well as the people processes. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this episode as much as we did in recording it. And if you would like to learn more about us, go ahead and subscribe to the podcast or join our research membership at redthreadresearch.com. Welcome to Workplace Stories, Nadia. We're so glad that you're here.
Yeah, excited to be here.
We would like, as we always do, to start off with you giving our audience a little bit of an introduction to yourself. So can you tell us a bit about who you are and the work that you do?
Yeah, I'm Nadia. I'm currently the head of people at Garner Health. I started as our director of people about 2.5 years ago, and then moved into the head of people role about 6 months ago. Before that, I've always been in tech with a pull towards the kind of fast-paced, high-growth journey. I spent 4 years at Chewy, the e-commerce company for all things pets, seeing it grow from about 5,000 employees, like a kind of a teenager organization, into 20,000 employee Fortune 500 publicly traded company during the crazy growth COVID years. And after that, I decided I wanted to join the startup world, oversaw the people ops function at a Series C tech company, Citizen, before joining Garner. In case it's helpful, a little bit about what Garner does, because I think it's helpful to put my perspective into context. We are a healthcare tech company with a mission to transform the U.S. healthcare economy, delivering high quality and affordable care for all. So big, meaty mission. How we do that is a little bit complex. I won't get too deep into it unless the audience wants that. But essentially, we use a combination of data science and financial incentives to get patients to the highest quality and low cost care, and to help doctors improve how they practice medicine through a data-driven approach. So we're doing something new and different, and what is showing to be quite effective for a very big problem of the cost and quality of U.S. healthcare.
I kind of dig that, and I can kind of see where your tech comes into play in that mission as well. So
yeah, exactly.
So this is a question we ask everyone as we start, but why should we listen to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think your listeners will have to decide for themselves whether they should listen to me. I actually don't have the decades of experience that many of your guests do. I'm in my position because at Garner, we value competency over experience. That's a very kind of key tenet of how we operate. But what I will say about credibility is that what we're doing at Garner from a people perspective seems to be working. We're one of the fastest growing healthcare tech companies out there. We're making tangible progress towards our very ambitious mission of transforming healthcare. I'm covering a workforce of over 400 exceptionally talented and driven individuals. We have 100 open roles, and our bespoke culture and people practices have been very instrumental in Garner's success and trajectory. So for those looking to build an effective and differentiated people business, I think this will be a really great conversation.
Absolutely. Well, those are the people who listen. So it's a perfect match. So when we did our prep call, Nadia, one of the things that we actually, for the audience, because sometimes folks like to know a little bit of behind the scenes, we were originally talking about just this focus on high-candor cultures, which we're going to get to. But through the conversation, what I was really excited about and thought our audience would want to hear about is this idea of business-enabled HR and making sure that truly HR is helping the business get to where it needs to go, and some of the things that you've done, particularly from a systems perspective. So can we maybe start at the beginning of that, which is how do you even define a business-enabled HR at Garner? And then secondarily, what are the systems or processes that ensure HR stays aligned with that broader business strategy?
Yeah, definitely. So in the simplest terms, I would define it as an HR function that is driving the business forward. But so if you think about this kind of HR maturity model, everyone has their own version of it, but I think of it like level one, transactional, compliance-oriented HR, where the function's largely operating as a cost center. Level two, efficient service delivery, process-oriented, operating as a support function. It's generally meeting the business needs. And then you've got this, like what I think is like the meaningful step to level three, which is when you get into that more solution-centric, outcome-driven HR with clear and ongoing alignment to business strategy. And then you got level four, which is like forward-thinking business transformation. The HR function is rooted in innovation. It's at the forefront of the strategy. Like I think Netflix and Bridgewater are good examples of that, where you've got like CEOs writing best-selling books about the culture and people strategy. So I would say Garner is solidly at level three. I think teetering on level four in some places. Ultimately, I think we will be a level four organization. Like I think we have all the kind of bare bones things that we need to get there, but we're still young enough. We're about 5 years old, 400 or 500 employees and growing and evolving very quickly, that we still have some open questions on kind of who we want to be when we grow up. And then to get to the second piece of your question on the system. So I guess just taking a step back, right? It starts at the buy-in, right? I don't think you can get this type of kind of cohesive alignment or transformation or even get the right systems in place without that foundational buy-in from your CEO and from the senior leadership team on why, people function and strategy is so critical and have it resourced accordingly. But from there, I think, it's about your systems and how your systems enable that alignment. So for example, at Garner, we have this like kind of crisp hierarchy in terms of how we think about strategy and prioritization, right? We've got our mission, which doesn't change. We've got our long-term plan, which is how over the long term are we going to achieve our mission? What is the actual business model and how does that break into potential products, phases? This is something we might update every 2 years or so. And then we have our annual plan, which is like, okay, what do we need to accomplish in the next year to make the right progress on our long-term plan? And this is not necessarily specific initiatives, but rather kind of our key pillars or areas of focus and key results for each pillar. So, it might be to improve our core user experience or launch our next phase of products or increase the impact and scale of our revenue generating teams. And then we have our quarterly deliverables. And that's really where the kind of people function comes in from like an alignment perspective, right? There's not always going to be an annual pillar tied directly to people and talent, though there could be. And either way, we are aligning our priorities to the business priorities, and we set our deliverables in the same way that any other business function would set theirs. There's not always going to be a one-for-one tie to a specific annual pillar, but we can identify the solutions that will enable us to better accomplish those key objectives. And often there's a people element that's contributing to that. A simplest example, right? If the blocker to improve or a blocker to improving our core product experience is our number or quality of engineers, then we need to understand what's driving that problem, right? Is it our headcount planning process, our interviewing process, our compensation, right? Are we not training our engineers and setting them up for success? Are we losing great engineers? Why are we losing them? And then we can use that information to influence what we prioritize as a people function, or even just how we shape our underlying mechanisms.
That's super helpful for laying out that entire process for folks. So thank you for that. One thing that Danny and I have had a question about, or maybe an internal discussion, shall we say, is how do you balance truly sort of following what the business needs, particularly when those quarterly objectives may change quite a bit, with what, as an HR professional, given the insights and the perspective that you've had, needs to happen. So, you're at a company that's, like you said, 500, you were at Chewy where you scaled from 5,000 to 20,000. And so you've seen a little bit of this map before, but where the business is now, you may have actually already seen this play before. So how do you manage that, following versus leading with regard to HR in alignment to the business?
That's a great question. And it's very topical, actually, with kind of a push and pull that I'm having right now with my CEO. I do think we take a very bottoms up approach to planning, right? It's kind of what is the business problem that we are trying to solve, and then what are the solutions that we need to solve that specific business problem. I think it's a bit of a symptom of our maturity or lack thereof, right, as an organization, and wanting to move very quickly and address problems very quickly. And so I think that I am kind of that that voice in the room of hey, yes, this is the immediate business problem, but let's look around this corner and what infrastructure do we actually need to solve that type of problem or prevent it from occurring again long term. So I would say it's probably less baked into our specific mechanisms right now and more of a mindset.
How did you get that mindset?
Me personally?
Yeah, you personally. That's a skill that is really needed in this industry right now. So I'm just curious, how did you develop that?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat from experience, right? I think, to your point, I saw this happen at Chewy, right? I saw what happens, honestly, when you don't really prioritize the people infrastructure from the beginning. When I was in my talent management role at Chewy, I was working on developing our first ever competency framework for 20,000 people. And it's man, this would have been way easier if we had really thought about this years ago, right? And then evolved it and things like that. And it's really hard to implement something when you're huge and far along. So I've seen some of those mistakes made. Luckily, we don't have any of those problems at Garner because we do have that just foundational buy-in from the beginning on how important this stuff is. And our CEO genuinely believes in it. And it is bought into making sure we have the right foundations, infrastructure, et cetera. But I think, yes, in the moment, right? In the moment when we're making decisions and trade-offs, it's not easy. And I think leverage a little bit of experience, a little bit of reading about kind of what's going on in the industry, and a little bit of intuition, right? Of, hey, here's how I'm seeing this holistic ecosystem and where the business is headed and what we might need to do about it longer term.
So it's one problem it's one thing to have you sort of focus on those problems that are just a little bit around the corner and being able to say, hey, these are the things that are coming. How do you bring the entire organization along? What systems and frameworks are you implementing to make sure that you and the rest of your team are always staying aligned with the business needs?
Yeah, so my team, right, I think we're still at the size where I am we're very tight alignment, right? It's not a huge team. We've got 20 recruiters, but they operate kind of as a machine, right? And then on the people side of things, it's five people, right? We stay very cohesively aligned. And I make sure I'm hiring people who have that business mindset of it's not a science, but it's hiring people who are really bought into the ultimate end impact, which is business results, not just people results. So I think that's one thing. And then I think from a systems perspective, one of the things that I really emphasize internally with my team is acting as a product owner. So I try to teach my team and try to cultivate the right mechanisms that make everyone feel like they are a product manager, and that we are not operating all of these types of individual tasks or processes, right? Everyone owns like a set of products, and it is your job to make sure that those products are continually meeting the business needs. So like, what feedback do you need on those products? Like how is this actually going, right? How are you assessing that? And like, who is the user, right? Is it working for them? And like, what are the inputs required to run that product well? Like, so anyway, yeah, it's a bit of a kind of like design and continuous improvement mindset, and some systems like, we have this like master tracker that's like, here are all the products that exists, and like, here's how they interplay, and like, here's who owns which one, right? Making sure there's clarity of ownership. So yeah, I think there's like, I do have a bit of an internal system that allows us to maintain that mindset internally as well.
Nadia, when you said that you encourage your HR leaders to think about their work as a product, can you give an example of that? Like, what is an HR product?
So an HR product is potentially like our performance reviews process, right? Like, so some people might think of that as just a process in itself, right? And it's kind of like, this is something that like we have to do on an annual, biannual basis. It's just this thing we do and this process we run, right? But if you think about it from like a product perspective, it's like, okay, who is our actual user of this thing, right? What is the objective? How do we measure success? And then importantly, I think in the tech world, right, is like, how do we make this as simplified and streamlined as possible, right? Like, how do we use technology to enable this thing? And then how do we like improve it as a product over time? And then, I'm not saying we've done this very well, but ideally then you also have like a bit of a like, you tie a bow around it, you maybe brand it, and you market it, right, in like a nice way internally so people get excited about it. Sure.
Okay, that's super helpful. Can we talk a little bit about then how you're tying those products back to the business outcomes that you're trying to drive? Because, right, like performance management is a perfect example, right? In so many ways it can be tied, but also it's a process that people love to hate. So how do you kind of take that conceptually and make sure that it is aligned to those broader priorities, and also that you're balancing the need for, particularly performance, consistency year after year after year with potentially changing business needs?
Yeah, I'll answer the second part of the question first. Like, the balance between continuous change and consistency is hard at a company of our stage. Like, I think it's a benefit that when you come to a company like Garner, right, you are signing up for continuous change. So like, we hire people who are looking for, like, they are inherently agile and they're looking for a fast pace. They want like real-time updates to things and aren't, hoping for that like year after year, I can expect predictability and things like that. So, right. So there's a little bit of a cultural piece of like making sure we're hiring the right people that are kind of inherently bought into that. And then I think it's really just like an agile approach to making these changes. So, we are not going to overhaul the performance management process every year, right? But we are going to make changes every year, right? And like, that is like almost a given. It's like, if something's not going well and it's actionable, like we will fix it, because in our company stage, a year is like a lifetime or even 6 months, if we're running it biannually. And so we will make iterative changes, but with that kind of agile mindset. And then I think the first part of your question was around like, how do you make sure the products and the way that we're developing the products stay aligned to the business needs? Is that right? Yeah. So I think I guess I would almost like go backwards with that question, which is like, we start with the business needs and then see how our products are meeting those needs and what products we might want to prioritize improving. So it's like, there's always like a list of a million things. Like, we have a constant list of like, we can improve this, we can improve this, we can improve this, of every different element of everything we own. But we got to prioritize our efforts, right? Like, we have limited resources and the business has limited capacity to absorb change. And so it's really, I think, going back to that kind of planning hierarchy of like, what is going to have the most tangible impact, and how does that impact the products that we develop or refine?
Okay, so I've noticed in a lot of the responses that you've given, you've talked specifically about measurement. We need to know how we're measuring it so that we know how we're doing. And I would love for you to talk just a little bit about that. How are you tracking the effectiveness of the HR initiatives, specifically against business outcomes? How do you do that so that you know what needs to be adjusted?
Yeah, so I will say this is kind of an initiative I'm working on right now. So I'll give you some kind of transparent insight into how I'm thinking about this. But I think about this in terms of a like KPI hierarchy. So I have my like 2 KPIs that I'm like, this is how I am assessing the health of the business from a people perspective. And those are regrettable attrition and employee net promoter score. Now, of course, like those metrics are not the top of the hierarchy, right? Like they're ultimately impacting the business's finances and ability to develop products and things like that. But those are kind of like the top of my hierarchy. But of course, those are not telling the whole story, right? If those indicators themselves are red, like they're below my target, that's going to tell me that something's not going well, but it's not going to tell me what is not going well, right? And so then I need to work backwards in my hierarchy to help diagnose, like at what point in the metrics is something breaking. And again, numbers are not going to tell the whole story. But like as an example, right? So let's say employee net promoter score, ENPS, is red. Then, we might walk backwards or dig into our hierarchy and find that like one of our onboarding success metrics is red, right? And so maybe something's going on right from the start. And or we might look at, what are the key questions on our pulse survey that are statistical drivers or at least correlators of ENPS, and which ones of those are red. And so then we can go look at the comments or stay interviews, exit interviews, right? And like how we might go address that or just diagnose further even what's going on. There could be a totally different source, which is right, like we are not hiring the right people and there's misalignment with our culture. And that's why people are not promoting our culture, right? It's unique and it's not for everyone. So we might then identify like that the cause is a different type of metric, like our mishire rate, or we might find that from our pass rate on our culture certification program. So we have all of these kind of metrics in place for individual elements of the life cycle or individual products that I am currently working on getting into a more cohesive system to allow us to see how all of those things interconnect.
Just one final question on this section is we've talked a lot about how HR is responding to the business, but how do you make sure that HR itself remains agile, that the people can respond, that you've got the structure so you can do those responses?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it comes back to our planning mechanisms, right? Like our quarterly planning versus annual planning, right? So a lot of companies try to tackle like, what are we going to do this year, right? And then you create these like big, meaty initiatives that take like many months to accomplish in a way that makes it a lot harder to pivot and it takes a lot longer to have impact. Versus we take everything in bite-sized pieces. So like we're literally looking at like, what can we accomplish in this quarter? Like what metric can we move or what and like thing can we build in this quarter, and like scoping initiatives like that. So I think like an example is, 6 months ago, if you had asked me like, what would I be focused on in Q4 of this year, right? I would have said hands down, like management development program. Like we have this big initiative, like we're going to upskill our managers. We're doing this whole training program and that's going to be great, right? We did part of that, right? We scoped it for a quarter. We did some bite-sized modules. And then over the last 6 months, we actually have decided to take a different approach to management development. Our business needs change, right? And we need to be able to adapt with the business. But we don't have to pivot or walk back some big program. We didn't waste any effort because we made a tangible impact with the modules that we did implement, instead of like building out this whole huge thing and then waiting to roll that out and then, potentially pivoting like halfway, but we made tangible impact on the issues that were the highest priority topics at the time.
What I like about that is it sounds like you actually knew what problem you're trying to solve, which so often we don't know. We might know the general problem, right? Like managers are not doing well. Like, okay, that's true of pretty much every organization we talk to. But it sounds like you had a much more refined sense of the problem you're trying to solve. And so you could get a better sense of, did these smaller interventions fix it or address at least it adequately? And then second, taking an approach we talk about it a lot, just agile development. Like we're going to do kind of the minimum thing and see how it does. And then if it really needs more, we'll keep going. And if not, we'll just call it good, which we don't necessarily hear that much in HR.
Yeah. I think that's definitely a kind of tenet of how we operate.
We're going to go to lightning round now. And I'm going to lead us off. So let's take this first question. The lightning round is just an opportunity to get to know you a little bit. And the first question is, what was your dream job as a kid? I'm going to guess it was not being the head of HR.
It was not. I actually thought I was going to be a gymnast. not necessarily because it was my dream job, but because I had devoted my entire childhood to competitive gymnastics. I
Oh
was
my gosh.
at the gym 4 hours a day, 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year in like a pre-professional training and competition program. So I think becoming an Olympic gymnast was pretty much like the only logical path I could envision at that point.
Wow. How long did you do that?
Only until like I stopped before high school. I think at a certain point I was like, I want to try other things. And like, this is my entire life. It was like, go to school, come home, do my homework and go to the gym and then rinse, repeat.
Yeah. Wow. We've never heard that one before.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a new one.
It's an
That's
interest.
awesome.
So this next one is kind of a new one for us too. What country has impacted you the most?
Yeah. So my mom immigrated to the US from the Netherlands and my dad from India. And we spent a lot of time in both of those places visiting family when I was growing up. So both countries had a pretty significant impact on me. But I think the most influential element was living in a mixed and what I would call kind of culturally fluid household where we always did things a little differently from my friends' families. Most notably, perhaps, was just the degree of independence that my parents gave me from a young age.
That's awesome.
And then the final question here is, if you could ask your pet one question, what would it be?
This comes up for me maybe once a day. So I am very happy to answer this question. So I am this dog, Milo, is sitting right next to me right now. He is the light of my life. Yeah, he was a stray. I adopted him when I was still in college. He was maybe 2 years old. So one question I would love to ask him is, what was your life like before you met me? But if I can only pick one, that would not be the one. So to give you a picture, he's 100% mutt. He looks kind of like a lab, but has no lab in him. And he's like this cuddly, sweet, smart, a little neurotic, but just well-behaved ball of love, except he hates skateboarders. Like he turns into another dog the second he perceive like the slightest sound or vibration or sight of a skateboarder, he wants to destroy it. And I have no idea why. So I would ask him, like, why do you hate skateboarders so much?
That's a really good question. I think rescues are such a good idea. I saw a bumper sticker the other day that was a little paw print. And inside it said, "Who rescued you?" I thought it was so cute. I'm like, oh, that says it right there.
Oh, that's awesome.
All right, we want to jump back in. I know we wanted to get this idea of high-candor culture, and I want to ask you some questions about that. But before we go there, I was wondering if you could give us an idea of what a high-candor culture is.
So a high-candor culture is a culture where people are, it's a culture, I would say, where like there's constant feedback and transparency going in all directions, and it's just ingrained into how the organization operates. So, for example, like at Garner, we have a very deeply rooted feedback culture, and giving constructive feedback, thematic feedback consistently is like about as important as, knowing how to do math if you're an accountant. It's so ingrained in how we operate, like who we hire, how we make decisions. And it, leads to better decisions, in my opinion, which I know we'll get into.
Yeah. I think this is super interesting. So in a former life, I did a little bit of instructional design for a little bit, and we had the opportunity to listen to Ray Dalio, his book Principles. It was his company, Bridgewater. They sent us a recording of a call because they were trying to teach people how to sort of exist in this culture, this idea of a really high. And it was so interesting to listen to. It was almost uncomfortable to listen to because it was so candid. You know what I mean? It was so different than most of the organizations that I've ever worked for, that it was jarring. I can understand what you were saying when you said, this culture isn't for everyone, because it is very different.
Exactly. Yeah, I know. It's funny. It's funny you bring up Ray Dalio because our CEO actually came from Bridgewater, and several of our executives came from Bridgewater and, worked closely with Ray. And so I think we don't like to say that we have a Bridgewater-esque culture, because I do think that we are very intentional about kind of taking the components of Bridgewater that worked well at least for the people who were there, and turning it into something that's going to work well for Garner, right? Because cut and paste culture from another organization does not work. So but it's interesting. Like it is like people come here and are like, oh, there's some remnants of Ray and that book Principles.
For sure. In part one, before we did the lightning round, we talked a little bit about the processes and systems that you've put in place that align HR with the business goals. And I'm wondering what role transparency and high candor play in continuing to keep those two things aligned.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, this is where it gets really interesting. So I think the main kind of foundation of how this impacts the HR business alignment is that we receive real-time feedback about everything from all directions, right? So it doesn't mean we act on every piece of feedback immediately, but if something's not working well for the business or there's an idea of how we can improve or like what we need to do differently, we will know pretty much right away. And so that helps with that just like continuous alignment and ability to be agile and adjust as needed.
So that's really easy to do in a smaller organization, but you all are working on scale. So how do you begin to do this at scale? And, certainly from whenever you started, which I'm sure was smaller than it is today, but then also how are you building the foundations for that moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on this topic, right? Systemizing culture, operationalizing your values at scale. But I will share my kind of simplified like 3-step framework for how I think about this. I think the 3 parts are expectations, mechanisms, and enablement. And this can be applied to systemizing any type of culture, right? It doesn't have to be a high-candor culture, but I'll explain it in that context. So for expectations, right, it's not just about writing in your company values or operating principles that you value candor, right? Like that's like precursor to all of this, but people need to understand what that actually looks like in practice. So for example, at Garner, we have culture competencies that outline what does courageous communication look like at each level of our organization. And then as part of that same step, like the same expectation step, you got to design those expectations into the decision-making systems, right? Hiring rubrics, performance reviews, development plans, promotion criteria, right? It shapes who you hire, how you grow people, and who you reward, right? So that's how you kind of start to at least like lay the groundwork to get a culture to scale well. Then you have your mechanisms, right? So, and this all apply more specifically to the feedback and kind of high candor element of this. So you have to design opportunities or even requirements into the flow of work. So it's like, this could be feedback prompts during one-on-ones, right? Like project retrospectives with like deep probing questions and like an expectation that the most junior person in the room participates, right? Non-anonymous surveys, right? Like not letting people hide behind closed doors and kind of crafting the prompts in a way that draws out candor. So for example, like in our 360 process, we ask, what can this person improve on? And it is a required question, right? Saying nothing will not be accepted. Everyone has opportunity areas. And these types of structured opportunities give people reps that then kind of build the muscle to give feedback in an unstructured and everyday moments. And then 3 is enablement, right? So you got to train people on how to do this well. And it is an investment to do that. It's not just going to like scale organically. And most people aren't naturally skilled at giving or receiving feedback. It's a learned behavior. So, and we've heard employees say like they've been penalized in a past role for giving critical feedback to a senior leader, right? It can be jarring. And so they need to trust that not only that candor is expected at your organization, but that they can do it effectively and that it will be welcomed.
So this conversation is particularly interesting to me and probably to Stacia as well because we think systemically. So we don't want to fix the people. We want to fix the people systems in case the people systems outlast the people in those cases. And so I think this is super interesting because what you're basically doing is you're taking all of the guesswork out of HR. And that's crazy because there's always been guesswork in there. The good old HR gut check and all the things, you know what I mean? Like, I think this person. And so it's really interesting that you're talking about rubrics and making sure that people understand that what the expectations are and all of these things that we have, I think as researchers, sometimes we take for granted that are happening, but the mechanisms, as you mentioned, and the implementation are missing in a lot of cases. That was just an aside. I do have a question because if you as HR are operating within the same system, there has got to be some experiences that you've had where people are like, yeah, your system sucks. You need to fix it. So I would love to hear one of those, you know what I mean? Like when this candor or this transparency got back to you, you're like, yeah, we need to fix that.
Well, so I think the like, this system sucks, we got to fix it, like is probably not unique to a high candor culture, right? Like I think you uncover that eventually in most places. Like there's going to be someone somehow in some anonymous survey or like, it comes up in some like formal structured opportunity to provide feedback or whatever. I think the differentiating factor is that we get it in real time, right? And so we can pivot on the go if we need to. And so I guess an example is, just going back to our reviews process, right? If there's like even the smallest thing of, hey, like, why can't I see level on the side, the sidebar while I'm completing my reviews? Like that would make it so much easier to just like not have to go back and forth between different tabs, double checking that I'm using the right competencies, right? It's like, great, thank you. Like we can make that change for everyone right now. Like, why didn't we think of that? Right. So like, it's like, you almost got these like thought partners across the business that are just helping to improve the work that you're doing. And you don't have to wait for the retrospective or whatever formal mechanism you have to implement those changes. Or like, I've had times where, I did like a training and someone's like, hey, this training like really didn't address this. I need like what information is, okay, great. Let me send out a follow-up recording that addresses that before everyone gets too far down the road on writing their reviews.
I think that's all I have to say about that as well. Because it does seem like improvement processes within HR are really, really long. They're super long. And I'm kind of blown away that you're able to fix them real time. Like what you just said, fixing a performance review process in the middle of it instead of waiting until next year when we do it again.
Yeah. And I will caveat it by saying, right, like it's far from perfect. There are lots of like more foundational elements that we cannot change in real time, right? Like if someone's like, and we do get this too, like we get this all the time, right? It's like, I don't agree with the way that we even think about talent and performance, like, and how we are assessing this, right? Or like, I don't think this competency framework isn't working in X, like we can't change those things in the middle of the cycle, right? And so those are the types of things that it's good that we get it real time, because then we can choose to dig deeper into those areas when the time is right. We then have the control to be like, hey, this seems to be on people's minds. Like, let's probe deeper into this particular topic in a more systematic way so we can figure out how and when to address it and not just like overhaul the whole thing in the middle of the cycle.
So speaking of performance management, let's continue that. I wanted to talk not just about the process itself and the feedback that you're getting, but how does this focus on high candor actually influence what's happening with employees in that performance? There's different performance management activities, including the review.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the probably the best example about this is how we treat our 360 feedback. So every company, or a lot of companies, I should say, do some form of peer and upward feedback, right? In addition to the standard downward review to make sure you're getting a well-rounded perspective. And when you configure the review cycle, like we use Lattice, you can configure it to have this feedback shared with the manager only. You can have it shared with the employee, but anonymized, or you can have it shared with the employee with the giver's name attached. Now, one option you don't see is publish this feedback to the entire company, which is what we do.
Wow, really?
Yeah. So at the end of our review cycle, we export all of the 360 feedback. This does not include the official downward reviews with like the grades. We email it out in a spreadsheet to the entire company. You can filter it by receiver name, by giver name, and see exactly what they wrote. So why do we do this, right? Like that's like the obvious next question. Because one, I think it's like, we believe in our value of candor and we want to walk the walk, right? We want to like actually have systems in place that help show that we are committed to this. But more tactically, and I think more importantly, like it helps normalize feedback, and it conveys that feedback doesn't need to be given behind closed doors. Like it's not a big deal to give and receive constructive feedback, right? It doesn't need to be this big thing. Everyone has opportunity areas. We should all be self-reflective, and like someone gives us feedback, like it's not an attack, it's an opportunity to help each other grow and therefore to help our mission. And I think like people see in each other. So, I'm a junior employee and I see another junior employee giving feedback to a senior leader as part of this process, right? Because you can give unsolicited feedback. It's not just like people requesting it from their key stakeholders. That's really helpful to know that it's like encouraged and appreciated and normalized, and that people are doing it and in all directions, which kind of leads to the next point, which is it helps people learn to give and receive feedback better. Like watching other people do it, not only helps like normalize it, make people feel more comfortable, but also perhaps think of ways to synthesize something that you're thinking about and like you're not quite sure how to deliver it in a constructive manner, or you're not sure, you're just not sure how to do it well. And so again, it's like that, it's a normalization and the like seeing what works, what doesn't, and just building that skill set and that kind of like reinforcing those behaviors as an organization. And then lastly, maybe more on the margin, it helps us, it helps celebrate wins, right? It's not all constructive feedback. And people can just see our holistic kind of strengths and opportunity areas as an organization, right? Like we can run that 360 report through AI and be like, what are we doing well? What are we not? Like, and everyone can see it. It's been kind of like a good example of just like who we are as an organization and how we kind of embed transparency into our systems.
I'm really interested in this idea of constructive feedback, and especially if most of it is negative, can be hard to sort of live in all the time. But you mentioned positive feedback as well. I'm wondering, is the culture sort of geared to maybe balance that out half and half, or how often does positive show up compared to the things that we can see that are wrong that we need to fix?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Like, I think in general, the companies that do this and that have this emphasis on constructive feedback generally don't balance it well with positive feedback. Like, I think that's a really hard challenge because you're almost rewarding the constructive feedback more. You're incentivizing people and like being like, oh, that's so great when someone points out something that's not working well, and it escalates it and delivers in a really helpful and constructive manner. And so I do think that like, even, we do struggle with that, right? Like sometimes positive feedback can get pushed to the wayside, and it's a little bit like less common. I think we have to be more intentional about creating those opportunities and kind of like, recognizing and reinforcing when it does happen well. I think it also kind of touches on another interesting component of our culture, which is like, we are like very high bar organization, right? Like not quite, like I said, we're not quite Bridgewater like type intensity, but it's like we are looking for like really high caliber talent and like really exceptional results, and like people who are going to like push themselves beyond what they thought was possible. And we focus on kind of talent density and things like that. So there is also this element of like, we don't really praise people for like just doing their jobs. And so, we don't want kind of a culture where like praise in itself is just like a given, right? It should be meaningful. But I think that's a big challenge, right? Like you want to create a culture where like people are doing exceptional things every day at Garner, and like that should be celebrated. Like it shouldn't be normalized that like we have this exceptional talent that's just doing it. Little things. I do think that's something that we can probably do better if you ask one of our employees.
Yeah. I mean, it is an interesting balance, right? Station and I, we have a small organization, but we have to balance that as well. Not everybody should get a trophy just for doing their job. But at the same time, we've found that it's kind of important to build in opportunities to just sit and think about the good as well.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about what happens after the transparency, because the transparency is crucial. But how do you ensure that it leads to actionable changes? So do you have examples of when it's led to either meaningful adjustments in HR practices or behavior or business initiatives?
Yeah. So I think I don't know if you're going to like this response, but it goes back, it really just goes back to our planning mechanisms, right? So like we are getting feedback from all angles, right? And like even like take our pulse survey or our engagement survey as an example, right? Like we have a systematic mechanism for collecting this type of feedback as well from employees. But we are never going to kind of implement feedback in isolation. So small tweaks around the edges, like absolutely, like some of those examples of like, hey, can you like send out another recording of like that addresses this thing, right? Like super easy, like let's do it immediately. But more systemic changes, we do need to take those into consideration, like in alignment with the broader like business needs and prioritization. And I think it's really easy when you have such like a feedback oriented culture to get into this like reactive mode of like, oh, we got to fix this, we got to fix this, we got to fix this, because we are just getting it all the time. I think an example of like how like, or maybe this is like a lesson that I've learned, and maybe this is actually a lesson that like a lot of companies haven't learned yet, that like this might be helpful, is like a lot of companies do engagement survey action planning processes, right? So you have an engagement survey, you get that data, and you're like, okay, which areas are we going to focus on? And then like, let's get that number up, or like, here are the initiatives we're going to do to address this particular area. And then it's kind of managed as this like engagement survey action planning process that is like disjointed from the rest of the company planning processes. So we used to do that, right? I used to literally run a like, okay, here's our focus areas as a company. And now I need each department leader to pick their focus areas for their department based on their individualized results. But what would happen is that there's no follow through, right? Like there's no accountability. It's not necessarily aligned to the broader business objectives, right? Like other things get prioritized instead. And there's no accountability. And so what we do now is we take that engagement survey data, right? And then we like embed that into our quarterly planning. So we're like, okay, like let's use this, like what, based on this and based on everything else that's going on, like what do we need to tackle? And so like, and there's always going to be something, right? Like I'm never going to like let us get off by saying like there's nothing we need to focus on, like everything else is more important. And we're like, okay, if this leader in this department, if it's that important that they do this thing, like that's got to be on their quarterly deliverables. Like that's the only way we're going to see that type of follow through and accountability. And then same thing on the people side, right? Like we shouldn't be just like blindly committing to like address, our job leveling because that was something that came up in the Pulse survey, right? Like, or like our compensation programs or whatever it might be. It's like one input into what we should focus on.
So a lot of times we hear from HR leaders at other organizations when they're running engagement survey or they're getting that feedback that, okay, that's great, but I don't have time to do this action plan, or I don't have time to implement these results. And it sounds like instead what you're experiencing at Garner Health is more of a seamless, if you will, kind of fluid approach to the feedback and the response, if that's fair to say. And so my question in this is, one, is that fair to say? And then two, is there something that people can kind of take away from this, which is like, how do we get it from being, particularly for engagement surveys, but it could be any action planning that comes out of an HR process. How do we get folks to kind of see this as like we're all in this to improve the process and we're all in this effort to make things better, not just when we run the engagement survey?
Yeah. No, I love this question. I think that's a fair way to characterize it, like that it is kind of a fluid process. And again, it doesn't work perfectly by any means, but it does kind of help us address things in a very intentional but bite-sized way. And then I think the second piece, like there's probably a few different things I'd say about that. One, I think it's like the underlying culture, right? Like I think we have leaders who are just, it's been ingrained in them that this is important and they are bought in, like that this stuff is important and that they need to get the most impact possible from their team. And the way you do that is by having a very engaged team and making sure that the people processes work well. And, there are definitely things that they might prioritize in a given day or week or month more than others. Like hiring for us right now is like super important. It's like one of the biggest blockers to the business is like how fast we can grow. So they're always going to, feel like that's the most important thing. But so I think that's kind of one thing is like the underlying culture. Two, I think we do have, it's not super structured yet, but we do have some accountability in managers' Pulse survey results being embedded into their own performance assessment. And so like how happy or engaged or effective your team feels, right, is part of how you will be assessed as a manager. And I don't think there's like a 1-for-1 that like managers are thinking about it in that way. But I do think it helps with the cultural piece of this is important. And like there will be kind of like follow through, circle back on it. And then lastly, I think the like having it in your, like, it's okay to say no, right? Like it's okay to say like, hey, like this score was low, but like look at like this other business KPI that has nothing to do with people that is like way more important to address right now. And like, that's okay, right? Like sometimes we have to make those trade-offs. And I think just like being really open and transparent about it and like having that discussion and being able to like talk about everything in like a cohesive way versus in like piecemeal disjointed processes really helps to just like prioritize the right things.
Nadia, thank you. I know we could talk for a lot longer, but we are at the end of our time. If there's one takeaway that you have from your experience, what would it be?
Build an intentional culture. It has such a material impact on what a business is able to accomplish. And there's no right culture, right? But it should be intentional and it should be systemized for what you're trying to do.
And take it. Final question. We ask this question to everybody on our podcast. And that question is, why do you do the work that you do?
A critical element for me is working for an organization whose mission I believe in and that I believe will benefit society in some way. That does not have to mean fixing the healthcare system, right? I think that's like an extreme example that I love and am deeply passionate about. But making the lives of pet parents more enjoyable and seamless is another example. But it's important to know that, all the work I'm putting in is going towards something good. And on top of that, in my role, right, I get to influence the mission through people. That kind of combines everything I love. I just love that HR, at least in the way that I do it, sits at the intersection between psychology, philosophy, strategy, operations, and EQ. And it exercises every part of my brain, and there's constant opportunity to have a tangible impact.
That's awesome. Thank you for being with us, Nadia.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Thanks, Nadia.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.